All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're going to wrap up this chapter. I'm really tying this idea of classification to evolutionary relationships. So let's take a step back for a second. And when we look at sort of this original classification scheme, um, we were working out of this five kingdom model. Your protista, your monera, your plants, your fungi, and your animals. Um, and it worked okay until we started recognizing something more than just different types of cells. So when we used to use this five kingdom model, all of your prokaryotes got thrown into this big lumped category of Monera, and then the eukaryotes were based on their nutritional function. How did they obtain nutrients? As we started digging into more genetic data, though, we realized that this didn't really hold up. And so it got split into this three domain system. So we basically added an extra level above that idea of a kingdom, where we took those prokaryotes and split them out into the bacterial domain and the archaea domain. And this is much more supported by these sequenced genomes, because what we realized is that although this used to all be that kingdom Monera, that's not really true. These are much more distinctly unique to themselves, and archaea are actually a little bit more um, like eukaryotic cells, which is sort of interesting. So we now work out of this three domain system, and then the kingdom, class, file, species system fits within that domain, each domain. And what it's allowing us to do is to gain even more insight into those really deep branches of this tree of life. So the ultimate goal here is to try and figure out, where did life start? What are our oldest ancestors? The deeper and deeper we get into those trees and to the roots of those trees, the harder it becomes based on the way that prokaryotes are capable of sharing genetic information. We'll talk a little bit more about that later this year as well. But the idea here is that common ancestor, whatever it may be, must have been much more like these bacteria, hence their need for their own domain, than when we see the eukarya and the archaea. These are more closely related when we start looking at things like rRNA genes that evolve much more slowly than some of the other molecular information in different cells. Again, so I mentioned this for a second ago, right? There's a lot more interchange between genes in different domains. So we talk about this idea of horizontal gene transfer, where we actually move genes from one genome to another, and bacterial species are much more flexible in doing that in their genome structure than, say, cells like us. So they can exchange things like transposable elements, plasmids, viral infections are capable of actually mixing up some genetic information, fusion of organisms. And again, that's what's complicating these deeper branches and trying to figure out where this all started. So we'll talk a little bit more about how bacteria are able to do some of those pieces. But for now, just recognize that it really does complicate the process because we're moving it between individuals in the same generation as opposed to vertical transfer, which is what we typically think about when we're discussing evolution and talking about reproduction from parent to offspring. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about this movement, lateral movement of genes, as opposed to a vertical up and down generational change. And so there's some suggestion that perhaps it's not really a tree per se. Instead, it might be some more of this sort of roundedness at the beginning, where it kind of goes back and forth between those bacteria and those archaea kind of fusing and splitting and fusing and splitting. Um, and then eventually we get really to that true branching point of what we see more of today. So research is still ongoing. We'll continue to look as our sequencing gets better, as our understanding of the way bacteria and even archaea, for that matter, are capable of sharing genetic information with each other, um, and see how this potentially changes again.